50 years ago, it was commonplace to have politically astute theologians, engaged in the public sphere. John Courtney Murray was on the cover of Time, as was Reinhold Niebuhr, I believe, and Richard Niebuhr. So you have Murray and the Niebuhrs, and then you have, of course, movements like the civil rights movement, which really would be, in many interpretations, a public theological movement, a movement for justice, obviously, but in a certain kind of tradition. So how do you think about that today, 50 years or 60 years later, the state of public theology in the US and maybe even abroad?
Well, I think those institutions and cultural settings which helped public theology to thrive in the 1950s and 60s are largely absent today. Now, I would say the two strains that you point to, one would be John Courtney Murray and the Niebuhrs. That was one set of approaches in which there was a strong intellectual tradition, use of much natural law reasoning, or conceptual biblical reasoning by the Niebuhrs. And in conversations with the leadership of American society, with the intellectual leadership of American society, for example, the school at the University of Chicago, those theologians, the Niebuhrs and Murray and others, regularly interacted with the great thinkers from the University of Chicago and Hutchins, and did so in a way that was meant to reflect upon the public consensus that existed in American society at that time about who we were as a nation, how we need to relate to each other civilly, how we set our priorities, how we make difficult decisions. So that was one strain. The other was, of course, the civil rights movement, which came from a wholly different context, in which there was a strong strand of biblical theology and a proto-liberation theology going on, in which leaders, very charismatic leaders, who were witnessing not only on their own behalf, but with the communities whom they represented and led and helped to form, witnessed to the injustices within American society and how those injustices were at war with the American creed of what we were supposed to stand for as a country. So I think those were two different elements of public theology that existed at that time. They were both overtly theological. Yeah. And I don't think we have that at the present moment.
So I agree, and I wonder what happened. There was a more stitched together engagement, an ecclesial engagement from the academics to their confessional churches and churches, and then there was that to the census, the popular sense. There was something more stitched in. Was it an overarching meta-narrative that was, we were all watching the same news type of thing? There's lots of ways to think about it. But.
Well, there was certainly more commonality in that period of time. I want to emphasize, though, that commonality also covered over certain injustices. For example, the Civil Rights Committee, women's rights, all those things were ignored in that commonality. But there was a great commonality. Also, there was more institutional support for this sort of reflection. We've now come into a much more fragmented society, I fear, in which there is not support for theological reflection, deep conceptual reflection about where we're going as a nation, and how we really begin and try to repair our ability to govern ourselves, to dialogue within our communities with civility, to deal with disagreements in ways that are respectful and yet make progress, and to have true governance. I think those have been sacrificed along the way too.
Yeah, I agree. I find that insightful. We wouldn't want to whitewash the injustices. That would be dishonest and be bad history. There has been, I know my students, teaching the undergraduates here at Loyola, they think that big institutions have failed them. And they'd be right. If you could outline financial world, some governmental, the church, in many cases. We can pick that up later. Let's think about your talk today, in which you isolate injuries to both the body politic and the body of Christ, and cite malignant polarization as a chief symptom. You ask a seminal question early on in your talk: how can the church effectively evangelize in such a politicized culture? And it's not a rhetorical question. So how do you think about that out loud? How can the church evangelize in this fragmented setting?
Well, I think the normal ways we have done that to try to contribute to the public conversation have been through the use of our tradition of natural law and reason, and contributing to the public debate in those ways. I think at the present time, we have an anterior question, and that is, how do we even get to the point where there can be effective public debate, let alone contributing to the resolution of specific issues? And those a priori questions are, how do we really try to construct and reconstruct a society in which governance and the common good are at the center rather than partisan political struggle, and the exclusion by both parties of large numbers of individuals and communities which are suffering.
Yeah. So. And along those lines, as you stitch through and create a really compelling case and argument and analysis, you do say things like partisanism causes moral blindness. We tend to have disgust more than compassion for our neighbors. We're unwilling to look at Black Lives Matter or a DACA issue honestly. We circumscribe them to somebody else's problem and fail in charity to understand our neighbors. We retreat into enclaves of our own making. You cite some jaw-dropping data from the Atlantic magazine. You have, in 1960, there's an article called "Let Your Daughter Marry a Democrat?" ? The Atlantic says 5% says no in 1960. Yeah. By 2010, 40%
say no.
Say no.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that was of either party. It was, would you be upset if your daughter married someone from the opposite political party? And it was actually much higher for Republicans. It was about 58% for Republicans and 30 some odd percent for the composites, about 40%.
Yeah.
But that's a stunning reality. And I think it really is an indicator that partisanship has become a shorthand for worldview. Yeah. I feel that very strongly, that people have invested partisan labels with their whole understanding of a series of issues of race, class, religion, patriotism, exclusion. All these things get jumbled together, and there's a good team and there's a bad team. And my team is the good team. And because that has become so pronounced in our society now, it really erodes the possibility of reaching fundamental consensus on important questions and important foundations for resolving the questions we face as a nation.
Yeah, there's so much there, and I think we'll walk with this a bit. So I think about this tribalism, which is it's an offshoot of polarization or a species. It's an old thing, right? And you're going to in your talk, you're going to suggest virtue as a response or a solution. But and I think there's something to do with the classical virtues. But you're suggesting gospel virtues, and so I'm thinking about tribalism, which is something Jesus indicts over and over again, right? And in fact, the beware of tribalism is actually almost like a central component of any authentic Christology because of the bloodline problem, right? So, but yet humans are ever prone to it. On one hand, we have community and solidarity. That's good, right? That's a good tribalism. Yeah. On the other hand, we have this other kind of stuff where we other people, and we don't want, and we demonize them. So, how would you say, as a pastor, as a theological thinker, what might be the way forward given those old problems?
Well,
in new settings.
I think we have to help our communities grow and help ourselves grow in a series of these virtues that will give society a way of moving forward. And one of them is the question of solidarity. Pope John Paul II really is the architect of this doctrine of solidarity in Catholic thought. What it basically says is, we are all debtors of the society into which we were born. We have all been graced by being members of our society. And thus, we owe to the society as a whole and to the other members of society a sense of unity, of contribution, of fellowship. And so that sense of solidarity is very, very, I don't think we have that much in our, we have it at moments, in terrible moments we have it, like 9/11.
Yeah.
It was palpable.
Yeah.
But we don't have it as an engaged and ongoing reality very much anymore. Also, this notion of compassion being fragmented is a great dilemma. We have a variety of wounds in our country. That is, we have the fact that black men particularly are subjected to tremendous racism. We saw it just the other day in the Starbucks episode in Philadelphia, that's a terrible reality our society has, and a terrible wound to black men and women and families. And at the same time, we have lots of young white men who grew up in a world in which their parents had jobs that paid well, that they were manufacturing, industrial, union jobs. That's gone.
Yeah.
And thus, and they have not had the level of education that prepare them for society. That's a woundedness too. Yeah. And the problem is the way our society teaches us to categorize issues and questions. One party orients toward one of those elements of woundedness, the other toward the other. And this, what needs to guide us as people and as citizens, our society and as communities, is understand that's all something that Christ-like compassion should call us to. We need to nurture and reach out to both those sets of divisions. And I fear we don't do that. And so unless we can begin to think consciously about what does it mean to be compassionate toward the various communities that are suffering in our country, regardless of how party structures treat those issues or ideologically how those issues come across? Where are people hurting, and what does it mean to be compassionate in the world today? That's the sort of thing I think we need to build up.
Yeah, I think it's quite clear. It really almost hurts to say when I think about this, because we have to transcend ourselves. Yeah. We have to, and there's likely grace involved in prayer and vulnerability, and we're not prepared to do that. We ask any U.S. Catholic, they're going to give you an epithet before they say they're Catholic. Yeah. They're going to say, I'm a JP2 Catholic, or I'm a progressive Catholic, or I'm a rad trad or something. And that doesn't seem, how did we get to be post-ideological that way? These culture wars of the 80s have, they're different now because the younger people are churched in a different way. But these culture wars are still hanging with us.
I still think the answer to that is if we go back to the virtues, that to the central virtues our society needs us to have at the present time, that will help us. Yeah. One of them is this virtue of integrity, in that I plead guilty to this. That is, politics, partisan politics, has an element to it of as sports can have, a visceral satisfaction. Yeah. And so we get into it, and we're for one team and against another team, but it leads to such a corruption now that we excuse everything from our team and condemn everything from the other team, and reverse ourselves if somebody did something that we condemned yesterday. All these things are indicative of a lack of integrity, and I think the greatest moral problem most of us face in our lives is we all have areas in our compartments in our lives where we're very comfortable. We've given Christ most of the compartments of our lives, but there's some we just want to say, stay out of this, because we enjoy it as we are, even knowing those areas are contrary to the gospel. I think politics is one of those. What we've really got to say, there's got to be a fundamental integrity how we approach this, and that notion of visceral competition is not helpful and is very destructive. So.
Yeah, I can think as a kid, I love sports, but and I would love watching, the pregame show.
Sure.
Have I replaced that with my channel clicking from MSNBC to CNN to Fox News and see what they're doing with this gladiatorial exercise? It seems to be the same kind of thing, the same kind of rush I get from.
Well, and just the very reality that we live in siloed news media.
Absolutely.
That when you were asking about what's changed from the world Murray lived in or Niebuhr, one of the primary ones was that in those days news was from 3 channels, and they were not all the same in terms of their reportage, but they were similar. Yeah. Now that had its minuses too, but we've now moved into a world where everyone wants to watch and can watch news which reinforce their biases.
Yeah.
Thus, the biases become more pronounced in society as a whole. That's very destructive and damaging.
I don't think it attracts young people either. They don't want any part of it,
Right.
to have a public narrative or engagement in culture that way. To think about virtue again, because, if we do kind of ethics 101, we have the classical virtues, and then we have gospel virtues. But if you have an ethical system, the virtue is on the actor, seems to be more than the deontological, which seems to be on theory or principle or something more abstract, and then consequentialism, which is on maybe pleasure, but on some maybe corpse cold set of consequences. So you are almost doing a nature and grace move, where we have the natural virtues and then the graced virtues of the gospel. Is that accurate?
It is. I would say I look on the virtue question as it touches upon what we need to do and be as a society. We need to really have a conversion to recover some of our ability to address the needs of the common good, to even get there. We need a foundation. In our early history, it's easy for us to forget that when this country was started, it was an experiment that was very questionable. There had not been a democratic republic in existence of any size, really since the Roman Republic, and that was marginally democratic. So when our founders started out with this, they felt there was a good chance this wouldn't work. And they felt that in order for it to work, there needed to be a set of attributes of the citizens built up over time. They called it civic virtue, that would look to the good of the society as a whole and dialogue and move in a democratic Republican way, and reach consensus and make compromises and erect policy and check imbalances of power as they occur. But they felt that religion was an important way to do that because it was a source of those virtues. So my argument is that before we deal with any specific policy question for our country, our prior issue is, how do we deal with these virtues we need to have within our citizenry so that we can begin to restore a sense of moving together as a nation to address the key issues that face us, and they're very substantial.
I would never label you anything politically, Bishop McElroy, but that seems very conservative, that kind of thought, to begin in the nearest duty, the nearest, experience, and not to, reduce it either. But that's the world that Pope Francis walked into when he addressed Congress. How do you think he thought about that? Because, and who prepped him? That was a beautiful...
It was a beautiful talk he gave, and as I mentioned in this talk I'm giving tonight, he was pointing to those virtues. He was saying, because he was coming into Congress, Congress which is divided along the partisan divides we've been talking about in these minutes. And so I remember he and the people at the secretaries checked widely, how should he approach the question? And I gave some suggestions. I was queried, a number of other people did. And in retrospect, I say we were all wrong on it. We were talking about different principles, and what he came in with was right. He pointed to actors in American history who are Lincoln and Thomas Merton, Dorothy Day, Martin Luther King, and spoke of what was in their hearts and souls that was transformative to the societies. What was the gift they gave to American society? And that's what we need. We need to be trying to move in that direction. And he addressed that whole thing before he got into any specific issues. And I think what he's saying is that the first question is, how do we form citizens who come to the public debate, to their role as voters, to their those who will be elected to leadership and public office? How do we do that in a way that forms an environment that can actually attain the common good? We do not now have an environment that can attain the common good or leads us in that direction.
And I just, I don't want to be self-serving, but it's the Hank Center and it's Loyola. This is why I work. I mean, we're doubling down. This is exactly what there's a need for this type of education. It's a whole, we're freer here in many ways to be literally Catholic, to account for the whole. Right. And I think with these fractures, we see it. Now, to stay with Pope Francis, with the Holy Father, and to think of, was it It's Monday. It's Gaudete et Exultate, and you made a revision in your talk because you know
That's
you,
right,
you
there were a
really
couple of things in there
something spoke to you.
Noticed, yeah.
But it is, and there's a theme. You know, all of his major writings. It's joy, rejoice, rejoice. The height of Christian life is a kind of understanding. And it's not Pollyanna utopia, but it's there's something else. How did you want to work in what he was? How do you view the exhortation, and how did you work with it in your revision?
Those are different questions.
Yeah, okay.
In this, the exhortation, to me, the most interesting part of it was there's a section where the Pope talks about everyone having a personal spirituality, and what he says is that spirituality is based on your talents and your challenges, and it really resonates with what I think, just in pastoral work, is the call of Christians. That is, we all have areas of virtues in life where we're okay, and we have some where we're not so good, and we're continually not going to be good at those, and that's just the way life is. We got to work on them. But there's an ancient tradition in churches that the most important virtues in the life of the Christian are those where they're quite good, and that's where we should put our energy, because it is in living excellently in a few areas of our lives that we transform the lives of others, that we really ennoble the world. I think it's a beautiful image.
Agreed.
And that's this spirituality. To me, what he's saying is that each of us has, and people find this hard to believe. He says in there, everyone's called to be saints. But I think when you look on it with this vein, that each of us has areas where we can live out quite beautifully certain virtues of the gospel. And that when we do that, we touch the lives of others. And that's how we're called to ennoble this world in which we live. That's how we're called to be saints. We're not going to be saints on most things. And there's certain things we're going to be far from saints. But we have these areas. And so this, to me, the most interesting element of the exhortation was that. But as it touched upon these questions that I'm dealing with in the talk tonight, where there were two areas where it started. One is, and this is a great wound within the life of the church, the split between the anti-abortion wing and the whatever you want to call
Eco-theology or something, or
social justice, social justice, however you want to call it, the pro-life and social justice, the split between life and dignity issues, by people who are filled with faith, and really trying to bring the gospel in the world with tremendous passion. But there's this split, and so he speaks to that in terms of what our teaching is, that it's a unified teaching. In terms of the burning lecture, it makes sense. But also, he speaks to what peacemaking means in this. We really need to have internal peacemaking in the life of the church on this question, so that everybody sees on either side of that divide. The people on the other side of the divide are doing something quite good. And I don't think we're there. I don't think we're near there. And so he has a beautiful section in the Apostolic Exhortation where he reflects on how hard peacemaking is. And I think this is one of the areas we have to do this within the church as a whole. Also, that peacemaking within our society. We need bridge builders.
Yes.
And we don't have a lot of bridge builders. There are very few bridge builders in our political leadership now. And that's a great tragedy for our society. We've got to produce something.
It's almost the first duty. It's so funny to have the pontifex. That's what, and Francis inhabits pontifex. I mean, each in their own way. But thank you for that. And even on that, I'm not sure. Well, it would be Pope Francis, I'm sure, but it would be others. But as a style, you're reflecting on being a bishop, and you're thinking about the teaching, the pedagogy maybe, or the approach to teaching. And you had said, well, we usually do things in ways that are kind of stressing, cognitive faculties, cerebral stuff, and being exhortative. And what Francis is doing, and what is perhaps needed, is that we may need to be more speaking to people through affect, aspiration, and inspiration.
Yeah, he's really saying on these types of political issues, what's more important is the interior, because it orients it orients us to do the right thing.
Right.
Okay. Rather than the outer, which is, we start with the principles and
all that,
go down to the issues and so forth.
Yeah.
He starts with, if we have the orienting principles of Christ, if we pattern our life after that of Jesus Christ, these other things will naturally. But sometimes when people would ask me around election time, how should I vote? And I would say, on one hand, I won't tell you because I don't think it's appropriate. On the other hand, I will tell you. I said, vote as if you believe Jesus is standing right by you in the voting booth, and then go with whatever you think he's going to guide you with, and whatever that is. And I think it's these orienting virtues which can help us form people who operate first from that before you get to any specific issues, and then they can lead to these issues.
I think you're right. And it's not it's a classic. I think it's very Catholic. It's not this or that type of thinking. It's an integral thinking, right? But you would, that's fantastic. Well, thank you so much, Bishop McElroy. I just have one more kind of question. It's different. It is a little bit of, ecclesiastical or church content. I think about the youth, and I think about the synod. And what do we hope to achieve by this gathering? What do you expect will happen? What do you, if you have your crystal ball, what are going to be some of the kind of outcomes of this year-long reflection on the youth and the church?
Well, I'll tell you, we believe in any synod, the Spirit has to be at work. The Spirit's going to have to do most of the heavy lifting on this one, because I feel this is the most important pastoral question we face in the church, certainly in this country and for most countries in the world. If we cannot find a way of engaging the millennial generation and engaging them robustly and in a way in which they feel at home in the life of the church, and they feel the church can be a place where they encounter God's alive and active in their lives, then we're going to have to close shop in a certain sense. We have to wrestle successfully with this. And what I would be ecstatic if what came out of this was simply a starting point for how we do that. When I was in San Francisco, we had a task force in young adults. We had one in San Diego, and we grapple with these things. But we're still at the starting point, unsure how to do this effectively.
It's clear to me there's a hunger. There's always a hunger, right?
Yes, there is. Well, I remember when we had a retreat for the leadership of the task forces in San Francisco with that commission. It was all young. The commission was all young adults. I wasn't allowed to be on it, even though I was the auxiliary bishop. I was working with them, but I couldn't be on it because I was too old. So everybody had to be under 40. But we had a retreat day for the 57 task force members that were there in committee met. And one of the questions was, what is the perception your peers have about the church? And they came with two words. One was distant. That didn't surprise me. The second one was exclusive. And I didn't get at first, but when they talked about it more, they meant judgmental. And I do think we have to take as a basic framework those two things. We cannot be distant. We have to find a way of being providing an intimate atmosphere for our young people, where they feel warmly at home and welcome. And secondly, the judgmentalism, which is the one sin. If you look at the Gospels, there is no sin that's spoken about more frequently than judgmentalism. And I think it's because Jesus knows all of us fall into it. It's so easy and to fall into. We do it all the time, and we're never going to be wholly free of that. But we've got to rescue ourselves from that. And the church itself cannot be judgmental, which is different from having standards. The church must have standards, and I believe millennials understand that. But that's different from judgmentalism, which is the tendency to somehow feel better when we can point out the flaws of others. It's a terrible human reality, but all of us do it. So anyway, I think those are two starting points.
They are, and it's I think Pope Francis. It's amazing to me how he embodies the gospel in that way, to not commit those things. He attracts by the pastoral sense he has a really honest, is it Ignatian and Jesuit? I guess to a point, but it's this is a man who's had experiences of being in exile and trial and has an authentic spirituality. So I don't want to have the last word. I want to thank you for your time.
Okay.
Yeah. Is there any final thought you'd like to add before we kind of?
No, just to reiterate, I think as we move forward in our country, we're going to have to come to some point where we fundamentally reassess how we engage in politics as a whole. And unless we can do that and begin to change some of the metastructure of it and the different attitudes we have, then we're not going to be able to recapture a sense of authentic governance and authentic cohesiveness within our society.
Right. I will insert one more thing because you did say this, and this is a symptom. And I think with your remarks today, you're going to help us get on our way. But can we stop? We need to get to governance and stop getting to demonization and campaigning and all that. Yeah. We really have to. We have to really take ourselves to the shed, as it were, and find the courage to make some adjustments.
Yeah.
Yeah. We look forward to your talk today, Bishop McElroy. Thanks for being here in Chicago.
Great to be here in Chicago. Great to be here in Loyola.
Great.